I quit my job to care for my fiance's dying grandmother. 6 days after she passed, the lawyer looked me in the eye and said, "Mia, she left everything to you because she knew what he was planning to do to you." I want to start by telling you I was not the kind of person who believed in signs. I was a project coordinator at a mid-sized logistics company in Charleston. I made $61,400 a year. And the biggest leap of faith I'd ever taken before all of this was signing a lease on a one-bedroom apartment without asking my mother first. So when Julian Voss asked me to marry him on a Tuesday in March in the parking lot of a Trader Joe's because he said he couldn't wait one more day to ask, I said yes without hesitating, and I believed every part of it. Julian's grandmother, Vivian Ashford, was 78 years old and had been the only steady adult in his life since his father left when Julian was 9. She'd raised him summers on Wadmalaw Island in a house she called Thornbriar, a low white farmhouse with a wraparound porch and 11 acres of pecan trees, and she had built, over 4 decades, a chain of 6 dry cleaning and textile care businesses across the Low Country worth, according to the appraisal that would come out later, $9. $2 million. Julian talked about her the way other people talk about their mothers. He kept a photo of the two of them, him at maybe 7, gap-toothed, standing on Thornbriar's dock in a life jacket 2 sizes too big, in the top drawer of his nightstand, and some nights I'd catch him looking at it before he turned off the lamp. When she was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer that January, given 4 to 7 months by an oncologist at MUSC named Dr. Adrienne Falk, Julian came to me in our kitchen at 11 at night, still in his work clothes, and said, "I can't watch her go into some facility with strangers, Mia. I can't." He said it 3 times, like the sentence needed to be repeated to become real. I remember standing at the sink with a dish towel in my hands, watching him fold in on himself at our kitchen table, and thinking that whatever I did next would define the kind of person I wanted to be. "Then we won't let that happen," I told him. I didn't know yet what "we" would actually mean, so I quit my job. I want to be specific about what that meant, because the specifics matter later. I gave 2 weeks' notice on February 3rd. I signed paperwork rolling my 401k, worth $14,300, into an IRA. I sublet my apartment to a coworker for 8 months starting March 1st, and I moved into the guest room at Thornbriar with 2 suitcases and a job that had no salary, no hours, and no end date I could see. For the first 6 weeks, it was just me, Vivian, and a rotating hospice nurse named Carol, who came 3 times a week. Julian drove out from Charleston most nights after his job at a commercial real estate firm, and on weekends, he stayed. I learned to manage 11 different medications on a schedule taped inside the pantry door. I learned to change a dressing on a port. I learned the particular sound Vivian made in her sleep when the pain broke through the medication, a short catch in her breath that I could hear from 2 rooms away with a baby monitor Carol had shown me how to use. I lost 11 pounds in the first 2 months without trying. Constance visited twice in those first 6 weeks, both times on a Sunday, both times staying under an hour. She was polite to me in the specific, careful way people are polite to someone they haven't decided whether to like yet. On her second visit, in early March, she stood in the kitchen while I sterilized a set of syringes at the sink and said, apropos of nothing, "It's a big thing you're doing, giving up your whole life like this." And I said something about not minding, about wanting to help, and she looked at me for a long moment and said, "Just make sure it's worth it to you, whatever happens," which I took.
Sorry to interrupt. Real quick before the story continues. If this story hit close to home, here's the thing. Most people don't figure this stuff out until years later, after it's already cost them something. I put together the manipulation playbook so you don't have to learn it the hard way. 49 patterns, real examples, and exactly what to do the moment you spot one. It's already helped hundreds of people see clearly what took me years to figure out. Links in the description. Okay, back to what happened.
At the time, as a strange kind of concern, and which I now understand in hindsight might have been the closest she ever came to warning me. Vivian and I fell into a rhythm neither of us expected to like as much as we did. She woke at 6:15 most mornings before the pain medication made her groggy, and I'd bring her coffee, decaf, though she pretended not to notice, and we'd do the crossword together at the kitchen table while the fog came off the tidal creek behind the house. She told me, in pieces over those weeks, about building the first dry cleaning storefront in 1974, with $3,000 borrowed from her own mother, about the 2 business partners who'd tried to force her out in 1991 and lost, about a husband who died young and left her raising Julian's mother alone. She never once in all those mornings asked me what I planned to do with my life once this was over. I think now that she already knew she was going to answer that question for me. She was sharp for most of it, sharper than either of us, honestly. She still did the crossword in 9 minutes most mornings, and she watched everything. The way Julian answered his phone, the way he stood a little too straight when he thought someone was assessing him, the way he sometimes watched me the same clinical way a person watches a stock ticker. I didn't understand, at the time, how much she watched, or how carefully. Here's the first thing I noticed, though I didn't understand it yet. In week 7, I came out of the shower to find Julian on his phone in the hallway, and he startled and turned the screen away from me. And when I asked who he was talking to, he said, "work," in a voice that didn't match the words. I let it go. You let a lot of things go when you're sleeping 4 hours a night. Here's the second thing. In week 9, Vivian had a bad night, one of the worst. Her pain broke through at 2 a.m., and I sat with her for 3 hours until the emergency dose kicked in, timed at 2:47 a.m. on the log sheet Carol had me keep. I cried in the bathroom afterward, word, quietly, for maybe 4 minutes, sitting on the closed toilet lid with the fan running so no one would hear because I was exhausted and scared and 29 years old and doing something I had no training for. When I came out, Julian was standing very still in the hallway with his phone raised at chest height, angled toward the bathroom door, and for 1/2 second before he lowered it, I thought I saw the screen was recording. A thin red dot, a timer counting up. "You okay?" he asked, sliding the phone into his pocket in the same motion. "Just checking the time," he added, though I hadn't asked. I believed him because the alternative didn't make sense yet, and because it is astonishing, in hindsight, how much a tired person will explain away. Here is the third thing, and this one I only understood in hindsight, with documents in front of me. In week 11, Julian brought a woman to the house he introduced as a friend from a support group for caregivers, a soft-spoken woman in her 40s named Dr. Naomi Kessinger, who said she was a licensed clinical psychologist with a practice in Mount Pleasant. She wore a cardigan the color of oatmeal and had a way of tilting her head when she listened that made you want to keep talking. She sat with me at the kitchen table for 40 minutes while Julian was on a call in the driveway, and she asked me questions that felt at the time like kindness. "How's your sleep been?" she asked, and I told her the truth. 4 hours most nights, sometimes less. "Do you ever feel like you're losing time, like a stretch of an afternoon just goes missing?" I said sometimes yes, caregiving does that to you. "Have you cried more in the last 2 months than you did all last year?" I laughed, a short, exhausted laugh, and said, "Probably, yes, of course. My fiance's grandmother is dying in the next room." She nodded slowly and wrote something in a small green notebook, angling it slightly away from me, the way you angle a test paper from the person sitting next to you. "That's completely understandable," she said. "I just like to keep an eye on the caregivers too. You're often the ones nobody's checking on." I remember feeling grateful for that sentence. I didn't see her again until the afternoon I would eventually confront her secondhand, through her own words, in a folder on Griffin Holloway's desk. Somewhere in this same stretch, hospice nurse Carol pulled me aside after a med check in week 10 and asked, in the gentle but pointed way nurses ask things, whether I had anyone checking in on me. A sister, a friend, someone besides Julian. I told her Bree called most weeks. Carol nodded and said, "Good. Caregivers disappear inside these situations sometimes. Make sure somebody's got eyes on you too," and handed me a printed sheet about caregiver burnout that I stuck to the fridge with a magnet and never fully read. I think about that sheet sometimes, still on that fridge, in a house that no longer belongs to anyone in this story. A piece of paper that was trying to warn me about ordinary exhaustion, while an entirely different kind of danger was being built 2 rooms away in Julian's home office. There was a fourth thing, smaller, that I only remembered later. In week 13, Julian sat me down at the kitchen table one evening with a folder of his own and said Vivian's estate attorney had recommended we sign a simple cohabitation and asset clarity agreement before the wedding, just to keep things clean once Nana's gone so nobody can ever say either of us married for money. I skimmed 4 pages of dense language I didn't fully understand and told him I wanted my own lawyer to look at it first. He said easily, "Of course, no rush," and never brought it up again, which at the time felt like relief, and which I would later understand was simply Julian recalibrating, choosing the insurance policy and the psychologist's notes as the quieter, harder-to-refuse path instead. Vivian died on a Sunday morning at 6:52 a.m., with me holding one hand and Julian holding the other. She had been unconscious for the last 31 hours. I had worked for her, lived for her, in every sense of the word, for 4 months and 19 days. I remember the hospice nurse noting the time of death on a clipboard, and I remember Julian's hand shaking in mine, and I remember thinking with a kind of numb clarity that I had no idea what my life was supposed to look like now. In the final 10 days, the hospice team moved Vivian to comfort-focused round-the-clock care, and I stopped sleeping in the guest room entirely and moved a cot into the corner of her room instead. On what turned out to be her second-to-last lucid afternoon, June 20th, she took my hand, her grip was almost nothing by then, a bird's weight, and said, "You've done more for this family in 4 months than most of them have done in a lifetime." I told her she didn't need to say that. She said, "I know I don't need to. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I want it on the record." And I laughed a little, because it sounded like something out of a courtroom, and she smiled faintly and closed her eyes and didn't explain what she meant. I understand it now. The funeral was the following Saturday. 210 people came, according to the guest book, filling the small Episcopal church on the island and spilling onto the lawn. I sat in the second pew, next to Julian, in a black dress I'd bought that Thursday because I hadn't packed for a funeral when I packed for what I thought was a caretaking job. Julian's mother, Constance Voss, sat on his other side and did not speak to me once during the entire service. The will reading happened the following Wednesday, at the office of Ashford's longtime attorney, a soft-voiced man named Griffin Holloway, who had represented Vivian's business affairs for 26 years. Constance was there. Julian's uncle, Rand Ashford, Vivian's only living son, flew in from Denver. Julian sat beside me and held my hand so tightly I could feel his pulse in his palm. Griffin read through the smaller bequests first. $40,000 to the hospice organization, the house on Wadmalaw Island's contents itemized to a cousin, a set of pearl earrings to a niece. Then he reached the controlling section, and the room went very still. "To Mia Calloway," he read, "who cared for me with a devotion I did not expect and will never forget, I leave the entirety of my estate, including all shares in Ashford Textile Holdings, valued at $9.2 million, to be held in an irrevocable trust with First Coastal Trust Company as sole independent trustee, with distributions to Miss Calloway Holloway at the trustee's discretion for a period of no less than 5 years. Rand stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. Constance's face went the color of paper. And Julian didn't move at all. He sat perfectly still, staring at Griffin, and I remember thinking his stillness looked less like grief and more like a man recalculating. There was no provision for Julian. Not $1, not the pecan trees, not the businesses he'd told me for years he assumed he'd help run someday. Griffin read on, through a clause I didn't understand at the time, a clause specifying that the trust was structured to be excluded from any marital or community property claim, regardless of Miss Calloway's future marital status. And I remember Constance saying, in a voice tight with fury, she was here for 4 months. And Griffin saying, without looking up, Mrs. Ashford's instructions were quite specific and quite recent. She amended this trust on April 9th, 6 weeks before her death. That's not possible, Rand said. Mom's estate plan hasn't changed since 2019. I signed off as a witness on that version myself. This is a later version, Griffin said, sliding a copy of the amendment across the table, the notarization stamp dated and clear. Notarized at this office. I drove out to Thornbriar myself to have her sign it at her request, on a morning your nephew was at work. Julian read the page without touching it, his eyes moving fast, and I watched his jaw work like he was chewing on a question he didn't want to ask out loud in front of his family. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost steady. Did she say why? She said, Griffin said, choosing his words with the particular care of a man who has rehearsed this exact moment, that she'd tell you herself, eventually, if she needed to. She didn't think she would need to. I didn't understand that day. Why Vivian would cut out the grandson she loved to protect me from a marriage that hadn't even happened yet. I understood 6 days later. Those 6 days are a blur now, but a few pieces stayed sharp. Julian didn't talk about the will at all the first night. He sat on the edge of our bed and said only, I need some time to process this. And I held him and told him I was sure there'd been some kind of mistake, that surely Vivian meant to leave something for him too, that we'd figure it out together. He nodded against my shoulder and said, yeah, we will. I didn't clock at the time how quickly he moved from stunned to strategic, how by the second day he was already on the phone in the driveway again, twice, both calls under 10 minutes, both ending abruptly when I opened the back door. On the 4th day, he asked me, in a tone so casual I almost missed the weight under it, whether the trust language said anything about who could petition to modify the terms if, say, someone's circumstances changed. I told him I hadn't read it that closely. He said it didn't matter, just curious, and made us both eggs for dinner. And I remember being grateful that night for how normal he was trying to make things feel. I didn't yet know that normal was, for Julian, a tool he was using on purpose. Griffin Holloway called me on a Tuesday and asked if I could come to his office alone. I remember thinking that was strange, but grief makes everything feel strange, so I didn't question it. I drove myself in Julian's car because mine was still in Charleston, and I sat across the same desk where the will had been read, and Griffin slid a thick manila folder across the surface toward me. Before I give you this, he said, I need you to understand that Vivian hired an investigator in early March, 6 days after you moved into Thornbriar. She didn't do it because she distrusted you. She did it because she'd started to distrust Julian, and she wanted to know why. The folder was 43 pages. On top was an invoice from a licensed private investigator named Dahlia Marsh, Palmetto Discretion Associates, itemizing 61.5 hours of surveillance and research between March 9th and May 22nd, billed at $180 an hour, totaling $11,377 paid in full by Vivian Ashford from a personal checking account Julian never knew existed. Mia, Griffin said, and this is the moment. This is the sentence you heard at the start. She left everything to you because she knew what he was planning to do to you. I sat in that office for 2 hours reading the folder cover to cover while Griffin waited, occasionally refilling my water, saying nothing else. I'm going to walk you through it the way I read it because the order matters. Each page was worse than the one before it. The first documents were bank records. In early February, 3 weeks after I quit my job, Julian had taken out a $2 million life insurance policy on me through a broker named Preston Isles, listing himself as sole beneficiary. I had never signed anything. My signature on the application, when I finally saw a copy, was forged. The M in Mia looped the wrong direction, something my real signature never does, something a forensic document examiner would later confirm in a report dated August 14th, stating with 94% confidence that the signature was not mine. The second set of documents were emails, 7 of them, between Julian and Dr. Naomi Kessinger, the soft-spoken caregiver support psychologist. The first, dated March 22nd, read, in part, that Julian was documenting patterns consistent with a major depressive episode with possible dissociative features in me, and asked whether such documentation, gathered informally over several months, could later support a formal competency evaluation. Kessinger's reply, dated March 24th, said it could, particularly if corroborated by video, and recommended he continue building a longitudinal record. I want to tell you what that meant, because it took Griffin explaining it twice before I understood. Julian was not planning to marry a grieving fiancée who might one day inherit money. He was planning to marry a woman he could later have declared legally incompetent, using her own exhaustion, her own grief, her own tears at 2 in the morning as the evidence, so that if Vivian's estate ever passed to me, a court could appoint a conservator over my affairs. And the emails made clear who that conservator was supposed to be. The third set of documents was the one that broke something in my chest that I don't think has fully healed even now. It was a retainer agreement, dated April 2nd, between between Julian and a Charleston attorney named Wade Ferris who specialized in adult guardianship and conservatorship petitions. The retainer described the anticipated matter as protective proceedings on behalf of a vulnerable adult, anticipated post-marriage, with an initial $6,500 retainer paid from Julian's personal account on April 3rd, 1 week before Vivian quietly amended her trust to exclude him entirely and lock the money behind an independent trustee no husband could touch. Stapled behind the retainer was a 2-page intake questionnaire Julian had filled out in Ferris's office, in his own handwriting, that I recognized instantly from years of grocery lists and birthday cards. Under nature of relationship to proposed protected person, he'd written fiancee. Under reason protective proceedings may become necessary, he'd written history of emotional instability during high stress period, documentation being compiled, anticipate control of significant assets post-marriage requiring oversight. I read that sentence 4 times, documentation being compiled. I thought about the phone raised in the hallway outside the bathroom, the small green notebook Dr. Kessinger angled away from me, and I understood, finally, that I hadn't imagined either one. The 4th document was the smallest and somehow the worst. It was a single page, a printout of a text exchange Julian had sent to a friend from college, a groomsman named Colton, on April 15th, 3 days after Vivian's amendment was notarized, though Julian didn't know about the amendment yet. Nana's not gonna live to see the wedding, probably, the message read, but once Mia's in the will as caregiver, which she basically has to be at this point, I figure worst case I've got grounds to petition guardianship within a year if things go sideways with her mental state. Best case she just signs whatever I put in front of her BC, she trusts me. Colton had replied with a single laughing emoji. Dahlia Marsh had obtained the exchange through a records request tied to an unrelated matter Colton was later involved in, a detail Griffin explained to me carefully, twice, to make sure I understood it was obtained lawfully. Vivian had found the retainer agreement herself. Dahlia Marsh's report noted that on April 8th, Vivian intercepted a piece of mail addressed to Julian from Ferris's office, opened it, her house, her right, she told the investigator over the phone, a call Dahlia had, with Vivian's permission, recorded and transcribed, and read it standing in her own kitchen while I was upstairs giving her granddaughter's fiance's grandmother her evening medication, the woman who was, at that exact moment, choosing to disinherit her only grandson to save me from him. She amended the trust the next day. I drove back to Thornbriar that afternoon and did not tell Julian what I knew. I want to be honest about why I was afraid, not of him hitting me, he never had, but of what a man capable of forging my signature and retaining a conservatorship lawyer before we were even married might do once he knew I had the folder. So I did what Griffin gently had suggested I might want to do. I started documenting on my own. For the next 19 days, I lived in that house like a stranger conducting an investigation into my own life. I found the key on May 30th, taped to the underside of the desk drawer above the locked one, in a spot I only checked because Griffin had mentioned, gently, that people who hide things rarely hide the key far from the lock. My hands were shaking hard enough that it took me 3 tries to get it into the slot. The drawer held a slim accordion folder, and inside it, printed and paper-clipped in order, were the physical originals of documents I'd already seen copies of in Griffin's folder, the insurance application with my forged signature, a printed copy of the Ferris retainer, and, underneath all of it, a single sealed envelope addressed, in Julian's handwriting, to WF, that I did not open, because Griffin had told me not to touch anything I hadn't already seen a lawful copy of, and because some part of me was afraid of what one more thing might do to me that week. I photographed everything I was allowed to and put the key back exactly where I'd found it, and I sat on the floor of that office for a long time afterward with my back against the wall, listening to Julian's car pull into the driveway 2 hours later, and made myself stand up and go make dinner like nothing had happened. I kept a log, dated and timed, of every conversation where he brought up how tired I seemed or how worried he was about me. 7 separate instances in 19 days, each one now reading, in retrospect, like testimony he was rehearsing for a courtroom that didn't exist yet. I called Dahlia Marsh myself on June 2nd, and she agreed to keep working, this time for me, at the same $185 hourly rate, because, she told me on the phone, Vivian already paid for the first half of this. I'm not leaving it unfinished. On June 3rd, 2 days after I found the key, I called Wade Ferris's office myself, using a voice I didn't entirely recognize, and told the receptionist I was following up on scheduling for the Voss matter. She put me on hold for 90 seconds and came back to say Mr. Ferris's next availability for the guardianship consultation wasn't until late July, but she could pencil me in provisionally. I said that would be fine and hung up before she could ask my name, my heart going so hard I could feel it in my ears. It was the first time I'd heard someone outside the folder say the word guardianship out loud in a normal office voice, as though it were an ordinary Tuesday appointment, and something about that ordinariness frightened me more than the documents themselves had. There were smaller scenes in those 19 days that I still think about. One night, June 5th, I sat on the porch at Thornbriar at 1 a.m. and called my college roommate Bree, and just cried into the phone for 11 minutes without saying a single coherent sentence, and she stayed on the line the whole time without asking me to explain, and at the end she said, Mia, whatever this is, you get to leave. And I remember thinking I wasn't ready to hear that yet. You don't have to have a plan tonight, she added, when I didn't answer. You just have to not be alone with it. I kept the phone against my ear, not talking, until the battery dropped below 10%, and she made me promise to charge it before before I hung up. On June 8th, I almost told him, I want to include this because it's the part of the story that makes the least sense from the outside. Julian came home from work with takeout from the Thai place we used to go to before any of this, and he was tired and normal and funny in the particular way he used to be funny, doing an impression of his boss's conference call voice. And for about 6 minutes, I sat across from him at the kitchen table and thought maybe I should just ask him. I actually opened my mouth to do it, and then he reached over and refilled my water glass without me asking. The same small automatic kindness he'd done 1,000 times, and something about the ordinariness of it made my stomach turn instead, because I realized I no longer knew which of his kindnesses were real and which ones were, in Kessinger's phrase, longitudinal record. I said I was tired and went to bed at 8:40 p.m. and lay awake until almost 1, listening to him move around downstairs. Another night, June 12th, I drove to the end of the Thornbriar dock alone and sat there for 40 minutes composing a text to Julian asking him to just tell me the truth, and I deleted it 4 times before I put my phone away and went back inside, because some part of me still needed the folder to be a mistake, some elaborate misunderstanding I could laugh about later. The tide was going out while I sat there. I remember watching a heron stand motionless in the shallows for the entire 40 minutes, waiting for something it couldn't see yet either. It wasn't a mistake. On June 9th, Dahlia sent me a final piece, a text exchange, subpoenaed later through a records request Griffin helped file, between Julian and Dr. Kessinger, dated May 30th, the day before Vivian's funeral. Julian: once probate opens, and Mia's technically the beneficiary timeline, Kessinger: 6 months mean for a clean competency filing. Sooner if we have more incidents documented. The insurance is separate leverage. Don't let her find that policy before the wedding. He had scheduled our wedding at that point for October 11th, 4 months and 9 days after Vivian's death. Long enough, Kessinger's text suggested, to build what she called a credible clinical picture. There was one more piece, the 5th, and it came from Dahlia herself rather than Vivian's original folder. On June 15th, she called me at 9 p.m., and I remember the specific tiredness in her voice, the sound of someone who'd been staring at bank statements for 6 hours straight. I found the wire, she said. $47,000, moved from Julian's savings into a joint account he opened with Wade Ferris's referral 3 weeks ago. Structured, and I mean structured, Mia, 4 transfers under $10,000 each to avoid the reporting threshold, as what the memo line calls guardianship contingency reserve. I sat on the edge of the bed in Bree's guest room, where I was staying by then, and didn't say anything for so long that Dahlia finally asked if I was still there. He was already paying for it, I finally said, before anyone even knew Vivian had changed anything. He was paying for it in April, Dahlia said, before your fiance's grandmother was even in the ground. I want to pause here and tell you what almost happened, because it's the thread that still isn't finished, and I promised myself I'd tell this honestly. In one of those texts, Kessinger mentioned a second name, R. Still in on this for her cut of the trustee fee negotiation, and neither Griffin nor Dahlia has ever confirmed who R was. I have a theory. I've never proven it. I'll get to that. Dahlia and I met in person exactly once during those 19 days at a coffee shop in West Ashley on June 17th, because she said some things were worth saying face to face instead of over the phone. She was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with the unhurried directness of someone who'd spent a career being disbelieved and had stopped taking it personally. I want to say something that isn't in any report, she told me, stirring her coffee without drinking it. Vivian didn't hire me because she thought you were after her money. She told me that on our very first call. She hired me because she watched you fall asleep sitting up in a kitchen chair at 11 o'clock at night, still holding a washcloth, and she said, whoever that girl marries better deserve her, and I intend to find out before I die whether he does. You were never the subject of this investigation, Mia. You were the reason for it. I didn't manage to say anything back to that. I just sat there and let it be true. By June 20th, I had everything organized into a binder. Griffin helped me build for what he called carefully protective purposes. Not a criminal complaint yet, just a complete record, dated and sourced in case I needed one fast. What I decided to do with it, I decided almost by accident at Vivian's memorial gathering. Vivian's actual memorial, a larger, later event than the funeral, the kind extended family and business partners fly in for, was scheduled for June 28th at Thornbriar itself, on the lawn under the pecan trees, exactly 1 month after she died. 46 people came. Rand Ashford flew back in from Denver. Constance organized the catering. Julian, still believing I knew nothing, stood at the head of the receiving line beside me in a navy suit, greeting Vivian's old business partners with the easy warmth of a man who thought his timeline was intact. I hadn't planned to do it there. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to how it happened. It wasn't stage theater. It was a decision I made standing on a lawn with a glass of unsweetened tea in my hand, watching Julian tell Vivian's longtime accountant, a woman named Faye Torbert, that he was so grateful Mia had been there for Nana at the end. Something about hearing him use the word grateful broke the last piece of my patience. I asked Griffin, who was there as Vivian's attorney and an invited guest, to step inside with me for 5 minutes. I asked him to bring the folder from his car, and then I asked him to help me get Julian, Constance, and Rand into the front parlor, the same room where Vivian used to do the crossword every morning, telling them only that there was trust paperwork to review before people left. 46 guests were still on the lawn when the 4 of us, plus Griffin, sat down. I set the folder on the coffee table between us. Through the parlor window, I could still see the caterers clearing the last of the shrimp trays off the lawn, 40-some guests drifting toward their cars in the early evening light, entirely unaware that the reason for the gathering was about to be examined 4 feet from where they'd eaten. Julian saw the folder, and I watched something in his face rearrange itself, fast, the way a man's face does when he's deciding in real time which version of himself to perform. "What is this?" he said, and his voice had the practiced calm of someone who'd expected, eventually, to be asked to explain himself. Just not yet, and not here, and not with his mother and his uncle, both close enough to hear every word. I opened to the insurance policy first. $2 million, I said. You forged my signature in February, before Vivian was even gone. My hands were steady. I'd practiced this, in the shower, in the car, more times than I could count. That's Mia. That policy was for us, for our future. I was going to tell you, he said, and I want you to notice that word, going, because it's the first move, and I'd read enough by then to recognize it. Denial dressed up as almost honesty. Rand leaned forward. "A $2 million policy on your fiancé that you forged," he repeated slowly, like the words needed to be said out loud to be believed. "It's not as sinister as it sounds," Julian said next, and this was the second move, minimizing, making the monstrous sound merely tacky. "Every couple our age does life insurance planning. Mia had no income at that point. It's practical. You listed yourself as sole beneficiary and forged her name," Griffin said quietly, 11 weeks before she was named the sole heir to a $9.2 million estate. Constance made a small sound, not quite a word. I turned to the emails next, the ones with Dr. Kessinger. I read the March 22nd line aloud, patterns consistent with a major depressive episode with possible dissociative features, in my own voice, in the parlor where I'd spent 4 months listening for Vivian's breathing through a baby monitor, and Julian's composure finally cracked into the third move. "You don't understand what it's like watching someone you love fall apart," he said, and his voice rose, and this was the blame shift right on schedule. "You were not okay, Mia. You were crying at 2 a.m., you'd lost 11 pounds. I was scared for you. I was trying to protect you. You were building a case," I said. "There's a retainer agreement with a conservatorship attorney dated April 2nd, Wade Ferris, 1 week before your grandmother found out and rewrote her trust to keep you away from it." I pulled the intake questionnaire out and turned it so the table could see his own handwriting. "You wrote documentation being compiled in your own hand, Julian." Rand stood up so abruptly his chair knocked against the window seat behind him. "You were going to have her declared incompetent," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Mom found out about this, and that's why she rewrote everything in 6 weeks. My God, she knew, and she never told either of us why." Constance had gone very quiet, staring at her son with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not yet disbelief, not yet anything, just a kind of suspended waiting, as if some part of her had been braced for a version of this moment for longer than she'd admit. That was a precaution," Julian said, and his voice had gone thin now, reaching for anything. "You don't know what it's like to love someone who's spiraling and not have any legal standing to help them if it got worse. You scheduled the wedding for October," I said, "and texted your psychologist friend on May 30th, the day before your grandmother's funeral, asking for a competency filing timeline. She told you not to let me find the insurance policy before the wedding. That's not love, Julian. That's a plan with a deadline." That was the sentence that started to break him, but it wasn't the one that finished it. I pulled out the last page, the message to Colton, printed and highlighted in one line, and read it aloud myself, because I wanted him to hear it in my voice instead of his own memory of writing it. "Best case, she just signs whatever I put in front of her because she trusts me. You sent that 3 days after your grandmother notarized the amendment. You didn't even know yet that she'd already cut you out." Julian put both hands over his face, and when he took them away, his eyes were wet in a way that looked, finally, less like performance and more like the floor giving out under him. "I didn't think it would actually. I told myself if you were really fine, none of it would matter. None of it would ever get used," he said, which is, I think, the closest thing to a confession I ever got out of him, and it wasn't an apology. It was an admission that the plan had been real and the excuse had always been ready. "Mia, I love you. None of this changes that I love you. You love me the way someone loves a house they're renovating to sell," I said. I hadn't planned that line either. It just arrived. Constance was crying by then. Not for me, I don't think, but for the version of her son she'd apparently also refused to see. "You told me in April you were setting aside savings for a house," she said to him quietly, almost to herself. "You told me that at Easter." Julian didn't answer her. Rand asked Griffin flatly whether any of this was actionable, and Griffin said carefully that forgery and insurance fraud were criminal matters for the appropriate authorities to evaluate, and that he would be preserving the full record. Through the parlor door I could hear a few of the last lingering guests saying their goodbyes on the porch, entirely unaware, and I remember thinking how strange it was that grief and exposure could occupy the exact same house at the exact same hour and never once touch each other. I didn't call the police that day. I want to be honest about that too, because it's not a clean ending, and I promised you the real one. I gave the binder to Griffin, who forwarded a copy to the South Carolina Department of Insurance, and, separately, to the state licensing board that oversees Dr. Kessinger's psychology license, a complaint that was still under review the last time I checked. 11 months later, its outcome unresolved. I never filed criminal charges against Julian myself. Part of that was exhaustion. Part of it, I've come to accept, was that watching his face come apart in that parlor was the only justice I actually needed in that moment, even if it wasn't the justice I was technically owed. I moved out of Thornbriar that night. Faye Torbert, Vivian's accountant of all people, drove me to a hotel because I hadn't thought to arrange anything, because I hadn't planned on ending my engagement on the same lawn where I'd just watched 40 46 people eat catered shrimp in Vivian's memory. I sat in the passenger seat of Faye's car with the ring still on my finger. I hadn't thought to take it off either in all the chaos. And somewhere on the causeway, back toward the mainland, I finally pulled it off and put it in the cup holder, and Faye didn't say anything, just reached over and turned the radio down a little, which felt like the kindest thing anyone did for me that entire day. Dahlia sent me an invoice for her final 19 days of work, 3607.50, and I paid it out of my own freelance earnings before the trust's first distribution came through, because it felt important that this last piece be something I'd paid for myself, with money I'd earned, not money that was still tangled up in anyone's estate. She waived the last hour off the bill without telling me until I noticed the total didn't match. Consider it Vivian's tip, she said when I called to ask. She'd have wanted the math to come out a little in your favor for once. The following months were smaller than the story that led to them, the way real life usually is after something enormous happens. I stayed with Bree for 6 weeks. I got a temporary job doing freelance project coordination for a nonprofit in North Charleston, work that felt almost absurdly ordinary after everything, spreadsheets and vendor calls, and I remember crying with relief the first time a coworker's biggest complaint of the day was a broken office printer. Griffin checked in with me monthly, first about the insurance and licensing complaints, later just to see how I was doing, which I don't think was technically part of his job. 3 years later, I still live on Wadmalaw Island, in a different house, a small one I bought myself, 18 months after the trust's first discretionary distribution came through, with money that still doesn't feel entirely real to me. I kept the trustee structure Vivian built. I never took control of Ashford Textile Holdings outright. I sit on its board now, 1 vote among 5, which I think is exactly what Vivian intended when she built the thing to survive people like Julian in the first place. I went back to Faye Torbert's firm, eventually, not as a client but as an employee. She offered me a job doing operations for 3 of the smaller Ashford holdings in year 2. Once I'd finished a certificate program in nonprofit and estate administration, I paid for myself, in cash, the first big purchase I made that had nothing to do with anyone's inheritance but my own effort. I like the work. I like that no part of my day depends on anyone deciding whether I seem stable enough to be trusted with it. The insurance fraud complaint against Julian was investigated and, according to the letter Griffin forwarded me in year 1, referred for possible prosecution, though as of the last update I received, nothing has gone to trial. These things move slowly, and I've stopped checking as often as I used to. Dr. Kessinger's licensing board complaint is, as far as I know, still open. I heard secondhand through Faye that Julian moved to Atlanta about a year ago. I don't know what he's doing there. I've stopped needing to know. Bree still lives in Charleston, 40 minutes from me now instead of across the country, and we get dinner on Thursdays when neither of our schedules blows it up. Last month, I finally told her about the sealed envelope in Julian's drawer, the one addressed to WF that I never opened, and she asked if it ever bothered me, not knowing. I told her it used to. It doesn't anymore. There's a version of this story where I open every last envelope and chase down every last name until the whole thing is accounted for, and there's the version I actually chose to live, where I let Griffin keep the file, let Dahlia's report speak for itself, and put my own energy into the parts of my life that were mine to build instead of his to unravel. I planted 3 pecan saplings behind my new house last spring, from cuttings off Vivian's original trees at Thornbriar, which Rand, we still talk occasionally, mostly about Vivian, let me take before the property sold. He told me, the last time we spoke, that clearing out her desk after the sale, he'd found a second small notebook, not Kessinger's, but Vivian's own, with a single line written in her handwriting and dated April 9th, the day she signed the amendment. Told no one why. Some things a girl should hear from her own life, not from me. I didn't know what to do with that sentence for a long time. I still don't, fully. I just know I carry it differently than I carry anything else from that year. Last week, I stood out back at dusk watching the saplings, barely taller than I am, and I thought about the fact that Vivian spent the last 6 weeks of her life reading mail that wasn't hers and hiring a stranger to follow her own grandson, and she never once told me why. She just quietly rebuilt her entire estate plan and let her lawyer say the rest after she was gone. I think that was its own kind of love letter. I don't think she knew how to write it any other way. I still don't know who R was in that last text message, the person getting a cut of the trustee fee negotiation. Dahlia has a name she suspects, a financial planner who briefly worked with First Coastal before quietly leaving the firm that same September, but she's never been able to confirm it, and I've decided I don't need to chase it anymore. Some doors get to stay shut. If you want to hear more stories like this one, the full show is linked below and on my channel. I've got new ones dropping every week, and honestly, some of them are worse than mine.